Welcome, everyone. Please take your seats. We are just about to begin. My name is Daniel McCarthy. I'm a vice president at the Intercollegiate Studies Institute and the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. I also write for The Spectator World and the New York Post and a number of other places as well. Our panel this afternoon is on America and the Israel-Iran war. Now, as you all know, one of the great successes of President Trump's first administration was that he involved America in no new wars. Within the MAGA movement, there was some dispute about whether or not it was beneficial that Donald Trump, in the early months of his second term, became involved in a new war. But it was a war that only lasted 3 days, and thereby was quite different from the decades-long forever wars that we were accustomed to under other recent presidents. So our panelists this afternoon are Max Abrahms and Curt Mills. Max Abrahms is Associate Professor of Political Science at Northeastern University. He is an expert in international security, especially in the areas of terrorism, U.S. foreign policy, great power competition, war, and the international relations of the Middle East. His remarks will tell us why the MAGA isolationists were wrong on Iran. Curt Mills is the executive director of the American Conservative Magazine. Now, the American Conservative Magazine was co-founded by Pat Buchanan, and Curt is very much an heir to the conservatism of Pat Buchanan, especially where foreign policy is concerned. His remarks will ask, Israel first or America first? So we'll get started with Max.
Thank you so much. We can't allow Iran to go nuclear. We don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. You can't have peace if Iran has a nuclear weapon. I want to see no nuclear weapon in Iran. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. It's very simple. They just cannot have a nuclear weapon. These are not the words of Benjamin Netanyahu or AIPAC. They're the words of Donald J. Trump, starting in November 2011. So, long before he became president, this was Trump's public position. It was also his position in his first term as president, as well as this term. Trump has never once contradicted this position. It's fair to say that there's no foreign policy issue where Trump has been clearer and more consistent for a longer period of time. It has been a bedrock of Donald Trump's foreign policy. And Trump is correct. A nuclear-armed Iran would be very bad for America and the world. Fortunately, most Americans agree with Trump on this issue. They understand that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, but there is an exception, and they're the so-called realists. The most influential realist thinker is Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. Many Soros and Koch-funded think tanks in D.C. regard him as an intellectual leader. Mearsheimer has long asserted that a nuclear Iran would make all of us safer. To be clear, the leading realist voice wants Iran to have nuclear weapons. Other realists claim that it doesn't really matter if Iran has nukes because Iran would be deterred from attacking us in the same way the Soviet Union was during the Cold War. But the Soviet Union is actually a terrible analogy. The right analogy is Pakistan, because like Iran, it's a major Islamist country that sponsors international terrorism. If you want to know why Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon, look to Pakistan, not the Soviet Union. So, what's the first thing Pakistan did when it obtained nuclear weapons in May 1998? The answer is that Pakistan dramatically ramped up its sponsorship for mass casualty terrorism against its adversary, India. Hiding behind its nuclear shield, the Pakistani military ramped up support for terrorist groups like Lashkar-e-Taiba. And after 9/11, the ISI backed terrorist groups like the Taliban and the Haqqani network to kill Americans. According to Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, the Haqqani network became a, quote, veritable arm of Pakistan. There's a reason Osama bin Laden set up shop there. The nuclear shield was an important independent factor in the rise of Pakistan-sponsored terrorism against both America and our allies. Of course, Iran is a much bigger state sponsor of terrorism than Pakistan, with an even bloodier history, including a very, very recent history of sponsoring terrorist attacks against America and our allies, including our allies, it should be said, who are not pro-Israel. So this posed a problem for Donald Trump over the summer because Iran was rapidly developing its nuclear weapons capability, and nuclear talks were going nowhere. According to our president, Iran was 4 weeks away at the time from nuclear weapons capability. And in her last assessment of Iran before the American intervention, the Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, hardly an Iran hawk, she also stated, quote, Iran can produce a nuclear weapon within weeks if they decide to finalize the assembly. President Trump, she went on, President Trump has been clear, this cannot happen, and I agree, end quote. On June 13th, Israel launched Operation Rising Lion, a series of precise airstrikes targeting Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure. A week later, on June 20th, Trump declared that Israel was, quote, winning the war while Iran was losing. It was widely reported that Israel's stunning military success against Iran helped to convince Trump to join the 12-day war. A day later, Trump launched Operation Midnight Hammer, where 7 B-2 bombers dropped bunker busters on the nuclear sites. Iran's own foreign minister, described the damage to its nuclear facilities as, quote, very serious, while damage to American forces was zero. The B-2s were over Iran for about an hour, and Iran did not fire a single shot. On June 23rd, Iran gave both America and Qatar advanced warning that it was lobbing some performative missile strike at American forces in the Gulf. And as intended, it was easily shot down. Trump described the pretend attack as, quote, very weak. And he personally thanked the Iranian leadership for not retaliating. The next day, Trump told Israel and Iran to end the 12-day war. Israel, which had air dominance from day 1 or 2, wanted to keep pounding Iranian targets. But Trump implored Netanyahu to call back the Israeli fighter plans, and Netanyahu followed the orders. Trump was rightly proud of the joint American-Israeli military campaign, and he said that both he and Netanyahu are now, quote, war heroes. Now, compare what happened in that 12-day war to the delusions of what I'll call the MAGA isolationist realists, sometimes called the woke right. MAGA isolationist realists confidently claimed that any American intervention in Iran would be just like the Iraq War. They said that Trump and Tulsi were lying, or at the very least, totally wrong about Iran's nuclear weapons capability, that the U.S. has no strategic interests in Iran, that Trump is some kind of a weak snowflake who can't ever stand up to Israel, that he'll only intervene due to Israeli pressure against his own volition, that the war will be another regime change war, that it will require ground forces and a long-term occupation, that it will result in thousands of American deaths in international isolation, and it will be another so-called never-ending forever war. Let me quote Tucker Carlson days before America's 1-hour flight over Tehran. Here's Tucker. In fact, there is zero credible intelligence that suggests Iran is anywhere near able to build a bomb. None. Anyone who claims otherwise is ignorant or dishonest. It's all a lie. Here's Tucker. The real goal is regime change. Young Americans are headed back to the Middle East to topple yet another government. Tucker went on. The American intervention, he assured us, inevitably means American troops and would, quote, end the Trump presidency. He said that the first week will, quote, easily kill thousands of Americans and, quote, collapse our economy. He said that an attack on Iran could very easily become a world war and we'd lose. None of these are far-fetched predictions, he said. They comport with the Pentagon's own estimates. Many Americans would die in any war with Iran. To continue with Tucker, it's clear that now is the worst possible time for the United States to participate in a military strike on Iran. We cannot afford it. Thousands of Americans would die and we'd lose the war that follows. Nothing would be more destructive to our country, thanks to unrelenting pressure from the neocons. This is suicidal, he said. Anyone advocating for conflict with Iran is not an ally of the United States, but an enemy. A strike on Iranian nuclear sites, he said, will almost certainly result in thousands of American deaths and cost the United States tens of billions of dollars. Now, this empirical embarrassment was widespread, I'm sorry to say, in MAGA isolationist realist circles. Let me quote Curt Mills in his magazine, The American Conservative. Quote, and not all of these are quotes directly from Curt, but they are quotes from American Conservative, and I got them from your Twitter and you tweeted them out, so I'm presuming some type of an endorsement. Quote, Tucker Carlson is right about Iran. On Iran, Donald Trump should listen to the former Fox News host. An American intervention in Iran would require a ground invasion and result in, quote, heavy American casualties. Quote, the notion that the United States can conduct a few airstrikes and declare victory is an illusion. Any direct U.S. military strike on Iran is likely to result in mission creep, which will lead to regime change and spiral into a long, protracted war. The 1-hour flight over Tehran, Curt told us, will be a forever war and an endless war. Quote, this is just like the Iraq War over 20 years ago. Trump doesn't want to intervene for U.S. national security. No, this would be a war on behalf of Netanyahu. A day before Trump snapped his fingers and sent the Israeli planes home, Mills warned, Trump is vulnerable to Israeli pressure. He has not shown a capacity to sustain a no to the Israelis. Curt is a frequent pundit on Steve Bannon's War Room, which constantly warned that any intervention in Iran will result in World War III. It'll be another never-ending war, just like the Iraq War. And this is a good one, quote, the casualties will dwarf anything we saw in World War II. Another big MAGA isolationist realist is Marjorie Taylor Greene, who repeated that any American intervention in Iran will surely be a regime change war, resulting again in World War III. But perhaps the most delusional commentary came from Professor John Mearsheimer himself, the leading realist thinker. During the 12-Day War, he repeatedly warned that there's a decent chance, a good chance, that Israel will use nuclear weapons, not a tactical nuclear weapon, mind you, for a bunker buster, but nuclear weapons in order to flatten Iran, and that Israel may well deliberately kill Americans all over the Persian Gulf in a series of false flag operations. Now, this is some really insane stuff. This is some really crazy stuff. It's probably the most inaccurate Mideast punditry that you can find anywhere. But it's not unusual, actually, for Mearsheimer. The leading realist thinker is nearly always wrong in his Mideast commentary. I don't have time, but I'll just give you a couple important examples. For example, during the heyday of Islamic State, when ISIS was poised on steamrolling Baghdad and Damascus, it was carrying out mass casualty terrorist attacks all over the world, including inside the United States repeatedly. Mearsheimer advised that the United States should not get involved in the campaign against ISIS, even from the air, because the United States had no ability to degrade Islamic State or dent the caliphate. More recently, Mearsheimer went on the Glenn Greenwald show to say that Israel was, quote, getting wrecked inside of Lebanon, and that Israel was concealing large numbers of totally made-up IDF casualties, and that Israel was doing no damage whatsoever to Hezbollah, including the pager operation, including the elimination of Nasrallah. So the question is, how did we get to this point? Specifically, why are there so many so-called realists? And why are they getting so much so wrong about the Middle East, especially in areas of terrorism and counterterrorism? And the short answer is the Iraq War. As everyone knows, the Iraq War was a disaster, a total disaster. In response to 9/11, America invaded an irrelevant country that had nothing to do with 9/11. We toppled the leader to spread democracy in the region and got caught up in a very bloody, unwinnable occupation and nation-building project. The war thankfully discredited the neoconservatives who had sold the war, but it had the effect of elevating the realists who had opposed the war. Now, that history is well known. But what's usually forgotten is that even during their pinnacle moment, when realists finally seemed to get something right, realists were hardly foreign policy geniuses. People forget why realists opposed the invasion. The main arguments of realists against the invasion were that a nuclear-armed Saddam Hussein would be deterred from attacking America, and that we can expect him to use his presumed WMD stockpiles against American occupying forces, and that Saddam could pass along his stockpiles of WMDs to terrorists, but the realists said that he probably won't do that because we should assume Saddam Hussein is a rational actor. Now, none of this analysis holds up very well when you recall that actually Saddam didn't have WMDs and certainly not nuclear weapons, and that Saddam actually didn't carry himself as a rational actor, or he probably would have allowed the inspectors in to show that he didn't have the WMD, rather than being killed and his country destroyed. But because realists opposed the disastrous war, they came to be seen as experts on terrorism and counterterrorism, even though in reality they don't have much knowledge on this topic. Realists are basically never experts on terrorism and counterterrorism, because within realism, terrorists are not worth studying. Realists, by definition, view terrorists as trivial actors in international relations, and so realists don't publish real research on this topic. If you look at the most cited scholars in the world in terrorism studies, you will not find one who's a realist. Even the academic leader of realism, John Mearsheimer, has no academic work on terrorism or counterterrorism. He just does podcasts for shows like Glenn Greenwald. Like all realists, Mearsheimer simply characterizes all terrorists as unimportant actors and opposes pretty much all counterterrorism campaigns because he believes, as a rule, they systematically don't work. It's actually deeply ironic that the Iraq War discredited counterterrorism, given that Iraq didn't perpetrate 9/11. The Iraq War is probably the dumbest test you can find to assess whether counterterrorism works. So that's the historical record on why MAGA isolationist realists failed so miserably to understand, to explain, and to predict the 12-day war. But I want to leave you today with a very clear thesis about the future. When it comes to matters of U.S. national security, don't feel compelled to align yourself on all international security issues with one intellectual camp over another. I'm very glad the neocons got discredited from the Iraq War and that they've never recovered. Regime change is a colossal disaster. We saw this not just in Iraq, but also in Libya and arguably in Syria. But this doesn't mean that neocons have absolutely nothing to offer. Yes, they're wrong about the desirability of regime change wars, but they're right about one thing. Unlike realists, the neocons understand that ideology and culture matter for U.S. national security. In this one sense, the America First movement has more in common with the neocons than with the realists. That's right, ideology and culture are fundamental to U.S. national security. Islamist terrorists who hate us, whether they're in Lower Manhattan or Gaza or Kashmir, they are not our friends, and they pose a very real danger to America, the West generally, and our other allies around the world. Realists, too, have something to offer. Realists can be useful in emphasizing restraint in conflicts with other countries. There actually isn't much daylight between me and Mearsheimer on the Ukraine war, for example. But when it comes to matters of terrorism and counterterrorism, in the Mideast region more generally, I urge you to instead look to actual subject matter experts based on their track records. After the Iraq War, realists said that the neocons must be held accountable for getting everything wrong with Iraq. I agreed then, and I agree now. But the same is true for realists about the Iran war. Frankly, I urge everyone to look towards President Trump, whose foreign policy stewardship in the Middle East has been strong, precisely because he's rejected so much of what both the neocons and MAGA isolationist realists have to say. In his first term, President Trump helped to substantially degrade Islamic State in its caliphate because he ignored realist thinkers like John Mearsheimer. On Iran, President Trump has succeeded because he ignored both the realists and the neocons. He substantially degraded Iran's nuclear weapons program without setting off another idiotic, never-ending regime change war. This is why the 12-day war was such a success. You're saying I'm out of time? Okay, so I'll just finish up and say that my thesis that I want to leave you with is that there are all sorts of different intellectual paradigms to latch on to. The realist paradigm, which Curt says he's a part of, has a very bad record in the Middle East on terrorism and counterterrorism. We see this really since 2001, but continuously and certainly through the Iran war. But that doesn't mean that realists have nothing to offer on other issues like Ukraine. When it's a conflict between states, the record isn't nearly as bad. Thank you so much.
Cool. Can you hear me? Man, that sounds so good. Why does anyone disagree with you? Good afternoon. Before the insults are, more insults are inevitably hurled and the Israeli-Palestinian peace process remains surely unsolved, let alone before America remains mired in endless wars in the greater Middle East, its broader public neither understands nor coherently asked its so-called leaders for the 75-odd years since the violent birth of the State of Israel, I must commend and thank the supreme organizer, the supreme leader, if you will, of this conference, Yoram Hazony, a by all appearances religious and sincerely religious man, a devoted father of many, including his own children, a bright and wily political organizer, historian, and philosopher. Thank you for having me. As I told the Daily Telegraph in anticipation of this conference, which some might give the backhanded compliment of CPAC for nerds or CPAC for the smart set, this thing is talked about for a reason. And if I could extend compliments to his native country, it's true too of his homeland. They don't sit on the sidelines. I must also thank our moderator, Diane McCarthy, my friend and mentor, career Sherpa, and as of 2025, 1/7 of my boss. Very gracious for you to have him as the moderator, Yoram. And he is the newest board member of the American Ideas Institute, most prominently known as the publisher of The American Conservative, of which I edit. For years now, but particularly since the re-inauguration of Donald J. Trump and my own personal appearance filmed at the midnight hour in Midtown Manhattan on the Friday night of the first presidential week of this new administration with the singular and aforementioned Tucker Carlson, the discussion at hand then being the Israel lobby's attempt to get one of our previously slated panelists, Dan Caldwell, who is unfortunately ill. Then the discussion was an effort by some in the foreign policy world to get Dan sacked from Pete Hegseth's Pentagon over his Middle East views. My own journalism reporting and posting on one former senior administration official's social media website has been defined probably ever since by strident intra-right criticism of the leadership of the Zionist project's inappropriate and dangerous political efforts in this country. Particularly and escalatingly and desperately and ceaselessly on the conservative side. And I think that we all know that this is happening. But what do I actually want? Besides an inchoate belief for the clicks, as critics may allege, that the gist of my advocacy and the analysis as my late mentor, dead 4 years last month, and surrogate father Mark Perry, who, apropos of nothing, was a longtime advisor to the PLO's Yasser Arafat, is my view, as Mark might have said after a scotch, simply screw Israel. It is not. More diplomatically, though, why have I become a hater and utterly convinced that the U.S.-Israel relationship, particularly when Republicans hold national power, has become a world historical, perhaps the world historical case of the tail wagging the dog? As former White House chief strategist Steve Bannon, as mentioned by Max, a longtime source of mine, as well as that of most of the fun journalists in this town, has taken to labeling the dynamic, Israel is a vassal state calling the shots in the world's most powerful empire, and regime change in Tel Aviv, his words, not mine, is necessary. This change in tone in my studies of Steve, to the extent that I understand him, has occurred in just the last 6 months. After all, this is a man who archaically refers to Istanbul and Turkey as Constantinople and Iran as, quote, Persia, not exactly the stuff of an Islamophile or a crypto mullah. Something is in the air. But first, I will attempt to preempt, or I guess preemptively rebut, some of the arguments of and welcome my co-belligerent Max Abrahms, who before today I had only met in Max's guise as a determined, if infinitely ludicrous and hilarious reply guy in my mentions, frequently insisting he would fail me in his class, teaching the immortal and exact and totally not subjective in the slightest science of international relations. I would prefer to at least minimize the degree to which we are talking past each other. Max wants to advance the cut, as you just heard, that baby MAGA isolationist, a uniform bloc and cabal of dumbasses, insisted that World War III would happen in June, and because we are all here at NatCon 5 today and not a heap of radioactive ash, that he is right and should never be questioned again. Putting aside that Max is setting up the Burning Man of strawmans, I submit I don't really want to talk about tactics at all. I seek to discuss strategy. Why are these our wars? Why are Israel's endless problems America's liabilities? Why are we, in the National Conservative Bloc, broadly speaking, why do we laugh out of the room this argument when it's advanced by Volodymyr Zelensky, but are slavish hypocrites for Benjamin Netanyahu? Why should we accept America first, asterisk Israel? And the answer is we shouldn't. But first, actually, on the tactics, I don't feel the need to concede that Israel, even Israel, triumphed in the 12-day war in June. The circumstantial evidence indicates that Israel is running out of missile interceptors. The indisputable evidence is that Israel needs U.S.-made and operated, meaning American troops, could be killed at any moment in another extraneous theater a la Abbey Gate in Afghanistan, THAAD missile systems deployed by no less than the Biden crime family itself and the previous administration to protect it. The most plausible evidence is that the Israeli propaganda machine has kicked into high gear since early summer to cover up the extent of damage imposed by the Iranians on the Israeli homeland, and what was still clearly a relatively restrained response by Tehran, hence no World War III. After all, Tel Aviv, those aren't Bibi's voters, he's a real nationalist. The Iranians concede they were surprised by the war, failing to anticipate the objective daring of the Israeli prime minister of another country's resources and reputation, but it appeared to have moved quickly and quickly rallied by the end of that month. It's not clear the June ceasefire was brokered per se for Iran's benefit as much as for Israel's, especially as President Trump showed limited appetite in the later days of the crisis. No America meant Israel on its own, which meant Israel would have to make decisions with its own capabilities, which are still pretty immense, but not the full weight of what some might term Uncle Sucker, as it should be. As David Hurst of the Middle East Eye observed, Iran and its limited response inflicted more damage in a few days than Hamas's own homegrown rockets, or Hezbollah's previously vaunted arsenal landed in nearly 2 years of conflict. With the recession of Netanyahu's poll numbers swiftly back to pre-war levels by some polls, the reality is that Israel is likely to come back to Washington asking for even more very soon. If you give a mouse a cookie, he's going to want a glass of milk. Since Israel's inception, America has struggled, and I argue failed, to have an appropriately mutually self-reliant relationship with the Jewish state. It's clear now in the full view of history. Harry Truman's relationship, and I note he was a Democrat for what it's worth, with the state's founders, many of them by most measures former terrorists, if Max wanted to focus on that, was controversial in the 1948 election. Dwight D. Eisenhower threw a wrench into early plans for a greater Israel, the new old term of art of Netanyahu, during the Suez Crisis. Kennedy courageously sought to limit and negate the nascent Israeli nuclear program at Dimona, but didn't live long enough to pursue that policy with long-lasting vigor. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, was a big government militarist par excellence, as the country learned the hard way in Vietnam. I could go on, but it's very arguable that only Eisenhower, Kennedy, the first George Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump have challenged the fragile and dangerous consensus around a country, to paraphrase the president, that doesn't know what the F it's doing. But the problem is the country does know what the F it's doing, quoting the president. First, Israel has made crucial investment in appealing to President Trump's vanity. As the president told the Daily Caller's Reagan Reese over the weekend, so Israel is amazing, quote, because you know I have good support from Israel. I have. Look, nobody has done more for Israel than I have, including the recent attacks with Iran. President Trump again went on to hail the historic strength of Israel's lobby, the president's words, not mine, making clear for Trump why the U.S. is involved as all. It's clear as day for him, Israel, because Israel loves him. In exchange, though, they are asking for the political capital of his administration and risking the generational impression that Middle East wars, no matter what the GOP says about the new right or changing this or changing that, what we learned this time, it is risking the generational impression that all the GOP delivers is tax cuts and wars in the Middle East. President Trump did not answer the reporter Reagan Reese's question. Reese queried the first question of her sit-down, which I will note, a different war, Israel. A March Pew poll found that 53% of surveyed U.S. adults had an unfavorable view of Israel. That's down, or that is up, from 42% in 2022. Among young Republicans under 50, 50% have an unfavorable view of Israel. That's up from 35% in 2022. There's a growing group within MAGA, America First coalition, Republicans, especially younger Republicans, who are skeptical of our support for Israel. Are you aware of this group? Are you worried about it? Again, her quote. On the home front, this dynamic is dementing. One can be forgiven for believing the only people this administration is reliably deporting are supporters of the Palestinian cause. After riding back into power on the appeal of free speech, enshrined in the First Amendment of this country's Constitution, if conserving that isn't conservatism, I don't know what is. This administration has used its influence to attempt and curb and intimidate speech on Middle East issues, particularly the State Department. After assembling and potentially generationally realigning cohort of voters disgusted with woke pieties and the suffocation of dialogue with incessant accusations of racism, Republicans have all too eagerly embraced holding the whip themselves, accusing countless unbigoted critics as anti-Semites instead of engaging on the issue. Never mind, in so long as we're casting the racism stone, which I thought was a leftist move, that is flagged by his biographer Jeffrey Wheatcraft, Winston Churchill, that strident Zionist and imperialist, and I may note non-American, said in the 1930s before the horrors of the next decade, quote, I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people, the Arabs in Palestine, by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, or at any rate, a more worldly wise race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place. This discussion almost always descends into the mud. But the mud is where this issue emanates from and why Zionism in 2025 is at best a morally dubious project. As the New York Times' Ronan Bergman wrote in his seminal Rise and Kill First, Israel has assassinated more people than any, quote, Western country since World War II, and one Washington should avoid as an entangling alliance with, as the city's namesake said in his farewell address, of foreign countries and foreign conflicts we ineluctably and poorly understand. As for Israel itself and its recent conduct, of which I, as a U.S. nationalist, feel I have a small vote in, since I remain an unwilling shareholder in this country and its activities given U.S. military support and diplomatic largesse for Jerusalem, as my late mentor said, referring to the experience of the Shoah, they know better. Thank you.
No, it's on.
It's not on.
Still not on.
We'll just get up there. That might be smarter.
I will do that.
That's probably just clear.
Okay. Are your microphones working?
Yes.
Yours is on? Okay. And yours, okay. All right, so we have fire and fury to start off our discussion here. Before we go to the question and answers from the audience, or questions from the audience and answers from our panelists, I wanted to begin by asking the panelists a couple of questions myself. And maybe this will be a slightly different question for each panelist. What I'm going to ask Max to speak to is, and really, I mean, both of these remarks of mine concern Iran. So with Max, my question is, you've laid out a case for the necessity of these strikes, this 12-day war, to contain Iran's nuclear program. Do you think that program is now going to be suspended? Will it resume? In which case, will we need more strikes, another war to once again contain Iran? Or does this eventually lead to a point where regime change does become thinkable? Because otherwise it becomes a continuous process of having one war after another to stop Iran from doing what it normally does. Then I will ask Curt, after Max has had a chance to respond, I'll ask Curt to characterize the Iranian regime and whether he sees it posing any danger to America or to the region or to anything that America might be concerned about if Iran obtains a nuclear weapon, and particularly the risks that Max has spelled out of a nuclear-armed state that's also a sponsor of terrorism and what the implications of that will be. So I'll turn to Max first.
Yeah, just quickly, I don't like talking about regime change. I don't talk about the likelihood, certainly not the desirability. I don't talk about possible successors. I don't talk about how, if at all, America should get involved. I'm categorically opposed to regime change to the point that I don't really speak about it at all because I don't want my comments ever misconstrued on that point. Because I've seen this happen a million times where realists will say a whole lot of nonsense and then they'll say, oh, but, the alternative must be regime change. Look at regime change wars. Everything's in comparison to what happened in Iraq or Libya or Syria. But the thrust of my talk is actually, you don't need to go in any of these directions. You don't need to be beholden to either realism with its absurd record on Mideast and terrorism and counterterrorism, or the discredited neoconservatives, who I'm so glad are now discredited, and that's why you barely find any in Washington, D.C. anymore. I never viewed the intervention in Iran as about regime change or ground troops or occupation or nation building. This was all just crazy Tucker stuff. I always viewed it as a nuclear issue and by extension a terrorism issue because they are inseparable. Again, the main concern, and realists also don't really understand this point either. They always say, oh, you really think that Iran is going to bomb LA? Aren't they rational actors? No, I don't think that. I think that they would act like Pakistan. I think that it's a lot better dealing with the Houthis when their sponsor doesn't have nuclear weapons. So I always viewed the limited 12-day, arguably 1 day or 1 hour American intervention in Iran, not as World War III, but as an opportunity to degrade Iranians' nuclear capabilities. And by the Iranian leadership's own admission, this has happened. Again, the Iranian foreign minister, not listening to Tucker, listening to actually the Iranian leadership, says that the degradation to the struck nuclear sites is very serious. In fact, the truth is that Iran was not anticipating that the destruction was going to be so great. And now Iran is actually quite upset with the Europeans, with the French, the Germans, the Brits, as well as even the Russians. Because although the realists said, an American intervention is going to lead to American isolationism, of course that didn't happen. But what Iran now thinks is that these core countries, the UK, the Germans, the Brits, even the Russians, actually assisted Israel in its attack, along with the United States, in identifying the most important targets which Israel and the United States took out. Now, I'm not going to say that that's the end of it, that we can just wash our hands of any concerns about the Iranian nuclear program. That would be absurd, but it's weaker. It's much weaker than it was had there not been an intervention. And by that metric, which I think is fair, the intervention was successful, particularly given the fact that Iran did not retaliate. So now there are discussions about, what happens next. Obviously, I would like inspectors to be on the ground. I don't know where the uranium is. And I would like to find out. The international community would like to find out where it is. And we need inspectors on the ground for that. So I do support the snapback sanctions, sanctioning Iran, which would limit not just its nuclear weapons capabilities, but also its weapons capabilities in other areas as well. And I'm glad to see that the Trump administration is paying attention. I think that the Iranian leadership is worried about the Trump administration. And I actually think that that is a good thing. I think that that will make reconstituting the nuclear program more difficult. And in turn, that will reduce the likelihood of Iran getting a nuclear weapon and sponsoring even more terrorism around the world.
And that's a great segue to Curt's part of this discussion. Iran supporting terrorism, which is a fact. The idea that Iran with a nuclear weapon would be more bold in supporting terrorism. How much concern should America have for its own part about both nuclear proliferation and the risks of an exacerbated terrorism threat?
I think maybe I'm just a little less philosophical than Max or even you, Dan. I mean, there was a deal on offer before the 12-day war, so-called. The Iranians came to the table. That was no fait accompli in January. There was every indication that the hardliners within Iran's system, to the extent that we understand it, opposed that. They basically committed a volte-face. They reversed, and they came to the table. They were negotiating. Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy, is not a guy who really wants to waste his time, as far as I'm concerned. He flew to Oman north of 5 times. They had negotiations. They were ongoing. On my understanding, through both public available information and back channels, is that the offer open was 3.67% enrichment level. That's lower than what was agreed to in the JCPOA under Obama. So they could have signed that thing in April, and you would have had a better, stronger deal than the Iran deal. It's a fake question. As to other things they committed, this is less verified, but stuff like above ground inspections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think that hawkish policy experts weaponized the lack of understanding, perhaps by the president, of the distinction between zero enrichment and no nuclear weapon. Okay? 3% enrichment levels are not going to get you a nuclear weapon. It's not happening. And shifting it to 0%, which, this government, no particular fan of, was never going to agree to, sabotage negotiations. And the evidence of how tenuous that line was is that once there was a 60-day, the elapse of the 60 days that Trump had originally set forth, Israel, who I note is not a party to these negotiations, decided it was their move to enforce a deadline that was a negotiating table that they weren't part of. So pretty extraordinary. They knew they were lying about it. As to the question of Iranian sponsorship of terrorism, I do think this is shows the limits, and this is not at all just a Trump administration thing. It is a bipartisan foreign policy failure going back decades of just labeling anybody scary with a gun a terrorist. The Iranians definitely sponsor Shia militias. The Iranians are definitely a theocracy. The Iranians, especially, ask ISIS, can be pretty hard dudes. That being said, the idea that Iran is the seat of power of a bin Laden-style caliphate that poses any actual danger to Americans, I think is pretty fake. As to the damage that has actually been inflicted on American troops who died at the hands of Iranian proxies in Iraq, the U.S. shouldn't have been in Iraq. And so there are dangerous countries and dangerous regimes all around the world. When we look around and we have $35 trillion in debt, Americans no longer believe in the American dream. Per Wall Street Journal reporting this morning, Wall Street Journal not exactly one that wants to highlight that fact. And we asked how this all happened. The extreme imperial overstretch that it started at least in the 80s is a big reason why. And the U.S. essentially, historically, has had three interests in the greater Middle East. Number one, access to oil. We are a net oil exporter at this point. We can figure it out. Number two, shipping lanes. As laid bare in the Signal Gate controversy by the vice president, the Suez shipping lanes argument is a fake one. The U.S. is not getting most of its trade through the Suez Canal. It's not the 50s. That's over. And number three is defense of Israel. And I don't think the conduct of this Israeli government is worth defending. Thank you.
Can I just say, did you list terrorism as one?
What?
As in terms of...
I mean, if terrorism is defined by everything that Jerusalem defines as a terrorist...
Is terrorism not... Terrorism in the Middle East is of no... Did you forget to list terrorism coming out of the Middle East as a
I listed... I had my list. And I think if
terrorism?
If we want to have an argument about whether or not everybody that Israel labels a terrorist is a terrorist, then my answer is no. And I don't think the U.S. should be involved in enforcing the Israeli government's diktats.
So,
well, hold on, gentlemen. We actually only have
do a debate.
We only have about 30 minutes left. We will do a debate, but we will involve the audience as well as the panelists. Now, obviously, this is a very sensitive topic. We want good, strong questions. We want them, however, to be questions, not statements. Don't preface your question. Make your question something that ends with a question mark. Make it very brief. We want to try to get in as many people as possible in the 30 minutes that we have. Now, we have microphones situated in various places here. There's one over there, for example. Please line up, and I will take your questions in order. Paul, are you lining up to ask a question? Good.
Yes,
so I see that Paul Gottfried is here to kick off our Q&A session.
Yes.
And I expect that'll be a most informed and illuminating question. So
I hope so. Yes, my question is aimed at Max. And let me say at the outset that I do agree with most of his analysis of what's happening in the Middle East. And perhaps I break ranks for my fellow paleo-conservatives in doing so. But I'd like him to address the question of whether the debate between the realist and the neoconservatives has to be seen in terms of a much larger context, which is the neoconservative takeover of the conservative movement in the 1980s, in which I've written books, and the subsequent persecution of those who stood in their way. And I think much of what you describe as, MAGA isolationism may, in fact, be a kind of exaggerated reaction to some, what I think were real abuses of power by neoconservatives and efforts to stifle debate about Middle Eastern and other foreign policy questions.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, the neocons did a little bit like what the political left did in the United States, in the sense that they were in charge, I guess. They were making critical decisions, and they did an absolutely terrible job. And that creates opportunities for other groups to have louder voices. And the question now is, I guess, which voices should we be listening to? And my argument is that we should probably listen to the voices that have a good track record. And if you look at the last conflict in Iran, it's very clear that whatever we want to call these people, the woke right, the MAGA isolationist realists, on this critical case study, in the same way that the Iraq War was a critical case study for the neocons. On this critical case study, you're crazy to listen to Tucker, to Steve Bannon, to the other outlets that reported this nonsense. It's not really a surprise that they got everything wrong. In my estimation, they don't know all that much. Personally, although I'm very much opposed to regime change, that doesn't mean that the Iraq War should have discredited somehow counterterrorism. That's a really weird leap that a lot of people make, where whenever there's some kind of a emerging counterterrorism campaign, people say, whoa, look what happened in Iraq. It's like the one historical case they know, and it's not even analogous. One of the things, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Curt, because I'm going to try to paraphrase the way I understand your thinking, is that Curt argues, in my estimation, that Israel is some type of a strategic liability, that it's not a strategic asset, that for the United States, that for years Israel has said that it's a strategic asset, and Curt is pushing back against the idea that it's an asset for the United States, and indeed Curt seems to think that it's a liability, and therefore the United States should distance itself from Israel. I'm very familiar with this kind of argument. It's been going on for decades, and it seems to have really peaked today in elements of the MAGA movement, where people like Curt are saying, whoa, Israel's really a strategic liability. The thing is, it's almost ironic that this argument is rising in MAGA at precisely the time that Israel has so demonstrably shown its value to the United States. Curt very briefly compared the case of Israel to Ukraine because both of them are recipients of various kinds of American assistance. But the big difference is that Ukraine is not a winner, whereas Israel is a winner. There's a big difference between supporting an ally who's actually doing winning versus supporting an ally who's doing losing. Just to tick off some of the very quick winnings of Israel, we see it against Hamas's militant capability as a terrorist organization. It's a shadow of its former self militarily. We saw this in Israel's confrontation against Hezbollah. It's a shadow of its former self. We saw this against Iran's nuclear weapon sites, which the Iranians themselves say is, very seriously destroyed. I mean, you could look over at the militia group in Iraq, the Popular Mobilization Forces. They didn't fire a shot. They were really, really quiet. And you know why? Because they didn't want the Hamas treatment. They didn't want the Hezbollah treatment. And just within the past few days, Israel took out the Houthi military leadership. So this idea that counterterrorism never has any gains, that we're just investing in Israel and it's like Ukraine and there's nothing to show for it, is deeply ironic after this unbelievable spate of military successes.
So a brief response from Curt.
Very brief. Since you're obsessed with labels and jargon, can you name one neocon that was aghast at President Trump's decision in June and the drive towards war with Iran? Just one neocon who was upset. Since you're saying this is like this insane like juxtaposition and like you keep using words, jargon, like who is a neocon? Was Bill Kristol upset? Was Max Abrams upset?
Well, I'm not a neocon.
Was Elliot Abrams upset?
Unrelated.
Was Dick Cheney upset? Was Liz Cheney upset?
Well, the thing is, that's actually...
Because you keep saying you shouldn't listen to the realists because character assassination here, character assassination there. Look at your team.
It's not my team.
You have no team. You're an impartial broker and
Curt,
a scientist.
Let's let Max
I'm certainly
respond.
not a neocon. For example, I opposed, I was too young for the Iraq War, but I opposed Libya. I opposed supporting the rebels in Syria. I was opposed toppling Assad. In that sense, my policy prescription was different than Israel's. I didn't want to create a power vacuum there. Well, your point, for me to identify a neocon who was upset with the intervention is actually kind of consistent with my point, which is that it's really damn hard to find neocons anymore. Neocons discredited themselves in the Iraq War. We're not beholden to adopt this ideology, and I would be the last person to turn to it. So who was allowed neocon? I don't really know. I mean, they've discredited themselves so much it would be hard to find. But probably if you went on like MSNBC and you looked at some of these, these Democrats who were very big supporters of the Iraq War, who are anti-Trump, but I don't really watch that programming.
I know, Curt. Wait,
just-
hold on, Curt. So I know you're chomping at the bit, and the two of you could have a very intense debate, just by yourselves. But I do want to make sure the audience has an opportunity to ask questions, and I know we're short on time. So next question, please keep it brief.
Hey, my name's Anthony Constantini. This question is mainly for Mr. Abrams, but Curt, if you'd like to answer as well, I'm curious. You use Pakistan as an example, but Pakistan got the bomb in the late 90s, and we've done pretty much anything we want to them. We've invaded them repeatedly. We've launched so many drones that we've basically blown up I don't know how many weddings. My question is not saying, is Iran, would Iran be dangerous if it had a nuclear weapon? I can understand those concerns. But if Pakistan is your example, that doesn't seem that scary. I can't imagine anyone in the Pentagon wakes up at night clutching their heart about Islamabad, doing something to us. Could you go into a little bit more detail about why Pakistan would be a good example of this?
Sure. So it is true that relations over the past, even few weeks really seem to have thawed between the United States and Pakistan. A lot of my focus is actually on India. And if you watched, say, Operation Sindoor, where there was a mass casualty attack in Kashmir against Hindu civilians, it was very concerning to see that India, although it describes its response differently, my own assessment was that the response was very constrained. And the reason why it was so constrained, if you speak to people in India, as I do all the time, is because of Pakistan's nuclear program. Also, another reason why we're not as concerned about Pakistan is because we're no longer in Afghanistan. So we don't care so much about the Haqqani network and the Taliban. But if we were still there, that would certainly be more top of mind. I do think that Pakistan is a better analogy, though, than the Soviet Union, because they're both, depending on how you want to interpret it, Islamic or Islamist and state sponsors of terrorism. My point is that if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, it would be an even bigger problem for counterterrorism, because you're right, Iranian terrorism is a bigger problem than Pakistani terrorism. I mean, this doesn't need to be such an abstract conversation. I mean, let's think about the Houthis. The Houthis say they freaking hate us. They say they hate America. They say they hate Israel. They say they hate Jews. They target literally any ship that goes by them, something like over 100 different nationalities. Do we really want the state sponsor of them to have nuclear weapons capability? It would be much, much harder for the United States to respond militarily against the Houthis. It would be harder for our allies, Israel, to take out the Houthi leadership. Of course, there are Iranian terrorist proxies, not just in Yemen, but in Iraq and throughout the Levant area. And also, it should be said that Iran was just detected for sponsoring terrorism, not just in the region, but actually inside Australia, according to Australia. And the intel for that came from Israel. And it's interesting because Australia is not known as a pro-Netanyahu government right now. It's actually quite critical of Netanyahu, and yet still Iran is sponsoring attacks inside that country. Ask anybody, in DC who the #1 state sponsor of terrorism is, and Iran is typically at the very top of that list for a reason, in a way that Pakistan is not, and that's all the more reason why we don't want to give these guys nukes.
So, Curt, if you want to respond briefly, you can. Otherwise, we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, I mean, this is a filibuster. But I would say to the actual question, if the U.S. is not a trustworthy negotiating partner, which I think increasingly it's not looking like it is, and that is a problem for those of us who want to live in the United States after President Trump, the reality is we are encouraging countries to become more like Pakistan or North Korea, which is the only fail-safe from Washington is having a nuclear weapon. And as to the question of whether or not Pakistani terrorism or Iranian terrorism is more dangerous, I think that's laughable. Osama bin Laden died in Pakistan.
Next question.
Question for each. Big Bob from Naples. Curt, I actually respect your points of view. I don't agree. I have a question, and first part of it is, do you really trust Iran that we can deal with them and they'll live up to anything? But beyond that, I'd just like to ask you to do this, because I do respect your point of view. I would ask you to read Douglas Murray's book on what's going on in the Middle East, and also Josh Hammer's book, which I think is only out a couple of weeks ago. I think you might take a different point of view on it.
Okay, so sir, you've asked one question, and I think we do need to get to more of the line. So, Curt, go ahead and respond.
The first question was effectively. What was the question?
Do you really trust?
Do you trust Iran?
Do I trust Iran? No. If you're in a negotiating position, you generally don't trust. That line of argument is nihilism. It says we should never try to negotiate with anyone ever.
Next question.
I'll be brief. On the Friday after Election Day, Southern District New York Court revealed an assassination hit attempt by an Iranian group to kill President Trump. July 12th last year, Matt Getz came forward with a whistleblower, 5 other assassination attempts to kill President Trump. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, Curt, or not, but what do you think the appropriate response is for the United States of America when 6 times our presidential candidate, a foreign power, tries to assassinate our presidential candidate?
Well, first of all, I have not seen those reports verified in a way that I am comfortable with. But even stipulating that they are true, which I do not, I think the appropriate response is to stabilize our relationships with the ruling government of Iran and not get into a war because of loosely verified claims, which I don't know. I think we've done that before.
There's a court filing for you to read. I urge everybody in this room to read it.
Yeah, we should take the next question now. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much. This could be addressed by either of you, but I think it's primarily towards Mr. Abrahms. So, given the fact the United States has limited money and resources, and Iran has not posed a threat to the American homeland as evidenced by it hasn't, how do we justify bankrolling Israel in this fight when we literally could be spending that money to help Americans who are dying of drug overdoses or crime and other preventable causes? How do we justify as an America First movement doing this?
Yeah, I do consider myself America First. And the question is, what should be our foreign policy? And what is conducive to Americans first? I'm basically a status quo player right now with respect to the Trump administration on not all aspects of the Middle East, but with respect to Israel, which is a big part of our focus. I'm not very critical of Trump. In fact, the opposite. I'm complimentary. I'm essentially calling for a continuation of more Donald Trump. I am pro-Donald Trump. I think that he does a good job of being America First without burning our allies and vilifying them. I don't think that that there really is this kind of trade-off in the way that you're talking about. When there could be, I mean, if you're looking at like the Iraq War or the long-term occupation of Afghanistan, one of the things I like about Trump is that he has actually internalized the lessons of what not to do with respect to neocon foreign policy. But the notion that the United States supplying, say, $4 billion a year for Israel to use that money to purchase American weapons to beat the shit out of Hamas and Hezbollah and the Houthis and to degrade Iran's nuclear program, the idea that there's some sort of a huge trade-off in terms of the benefits to Americans, that's really just silly rhetoric.
Next question. When you ask a question, please do briefly introduce yourself. Just say your name and where you're from.
JP Villasmill, formerly with The Spectator. So my question's for Mr. Abrams, but of course, Curt, if you want to say anything, you can say something. But you describe yourself kind of like as a foreign policy non-binary, but the state of Israel has not and does not. In my time in Israel, talking to former IDF spokesmen in the U.S., interacting with Danny Danon, the UN ambassador for Israel, they seem to sometimes allude to like regime change. And like if anyone that like dives deeply into Israeli behavior in the past with Iraq and today knows that regime change, it's a motivation. It's something that they talk about. So not you as a foreign policy non-binary, but like if you were a U.S. strategist, would this change your perspective of how we interact with Israel?
Where America First has been useful, and where I agree with them, is that U.S. interests and Israeli interests are not identical. There's no question about that. We know the international system is anarchical and all countries have their own interests. That's true, not just in terms of the dyadic relationship between the United States and Israel. That's true of all relationships between the United States and any other country in the world. And you are right that there is more appetite inside Israel for regime change than there is inside the United States. So be it. But that is not my position. That's the position of a large number of Israelis. I think Netanyahu would be happy if there was regime change in Tehran. To be clear again, I wouldn't support any U.S. involvement whatsoever in any regime change war. I think that the Israelis, it probably makes more sense for them than it does for the United States, because although I do view Iran as a threat to America in the world, it's obviously a much, much bigger threat for the Israelis because it's their top adversary. And so the Israelis are more motivated to topple the leadership. But I really think that Trump did a very good job of understanding the limits of essentially what Americans would tolerate and what would be good for Americans. And if the Israelis wanted to go on their own to topple the leadership, the United States should not be involved.
I mean, I think that's a la-la land answer. You're not the president, Max. The reality is that Trump specifically cited regime change in his defense of the 12-Day War. He cited Make Israel Great Again explicitly in the 12-Day War. It is very clear the coterie of people that have his ear this summer have been motivated by this. So I'm not really sure what we're talking about here. That's clearly the end game. That's what's relevant. Everything else is academics.
Okay, next question.
Hello, gentlemen. Connor Tomlinson, Courage Media. As a Brit, believe me, I empathise with Israel's desire to vaporise their jihadist neighbours who can't help but lob mortars over the fence every 5 minutes. But, especially for we NatCons in Europe who are under siege from our own governments engaging in replacement migration, this does have consequences. And so the conflict that's running parallel to and preceding the Iran war is October the 7th, the war in Gaza, ever since, and multiple members of Knesset, since 2023, have suggested that Europe should receive the displaced Palestinians that Israel, for reasons I understand, cannot live alongside. Yesterday, our government in the UK announced that they're expediting the rate at which students from Gaza can now come into my country. So how can Israel conduct this war against its enemies in a way that doesn't punish us and put terrorists in my living room?
I definitely don't think that I would not like to see, and I would actively, vocally oppose bringing any Gazans into any countries that don't want them. Certainly including the United States and including European countries. I think that there's a very good chance that they would be radical and that they would be very loosely and weakly vetted and share views which would be anathema to the success, really, of Western countries. Certainly, I would like to see the war prosecuted in Gaza in a way that minimizes and even eliminates any civilian bloodshed. That will require some separation between the civilians and the terrorists, but we do know, just look at 10/7. On 10/7, that wasn't just a Hamas operation. It involved at least 1,000, not even including the firing of Katyusha rockets in Gaza, but 1,000, supposed civilians going into southern Israel, chopping off heads, setting entire families on fire. This was carried out not just by Hamas, but by about 1,000 so-called civilians. If you look at the Shikaki polling data, which I've looked at for about 20 years, and it surveys the opinions of Palestinians, they are arguably the most extreme population in the entire world in terms of their support for terrorism, violence, suicide operations. So I feel for you, and I support you, and I would push back against welcoming that population into your home country.
So Curt does have a remark, but what I want to suggest is we'll take the next question, and Curt, if you want to just take the note you mentally have and add that to whatever response might come next. So, yes, sir.
Hello, Gamliel Atlan from Israel. My question is addressed to Curt. Apart from the perspective that might sound a bit naive, that you could negotiate with terrorists, not like in general, how does the US prevent the next 9/11? And secondly, how strategic allies, according to you, that are military partners of the US, let's say Taiwan and Israel, should they forget, according to your point of view, the US as a strategic and military ally?
Okay. Per Dan's instruction, I will note that Max did not really answer the spirit of Connor Tomlinson's question, which is, where should the Gazans go? Should they go here? Should they go to Europe? And he is quite correct that members of the Israeli Congress, the Knesset, have said they should go to Europe and they should go to US. I understand that fringe members of the Knesset don't necessarily speak for the country writ large. Same thing in the House of Representatives, but it is in the mainstream of Israeli society. And there's basically two options then, as far as I can tell. Kill them all, which I think you've had overtly genocidal rhetoric, to put it mildly, from the Israeli government. Or two, put them in a country like Libya, which, to answer how to avoid a new 9/11, don't put them all in a country like Libya, would be my answer. Okay? As to strategic allies, we don't hold our word here. It's clear we're not holding our word. It's clear that U.S. politics is extremely unstable, and that from administration to administration, they're going to have wholly different foreign policy priorities. I always give this cut. that the greatest danger of a Democratic administration is a war with Russia, and the greatest danger of a Republican administration is a war with Iran, and thus, accordingly, it's more ethical to be a Republican, because at least that won't end the world, probably. So I think if I were sitting in Taipei right now, and I think Taipei's messaging, frankly, has been ludicrously counterproductive for their own ends, I would not want an America overstretched. I would not want my broker, my banker, to not be able to afford to intervene on my behalf. And the way that that would happen is if the U.S. prioritizes. And because to the extent that I'm hawkish on anything, to the extent that I have sympathy with the hawks on any issue, it is China. But there's no way we're going to be able to handle it if we're doing a three-front war. And that is what was so dangerous about June. If Xi had gone into Taiwan, I don't think we would have been able to defend them.
So Max does have a remark here, but I want to do the same thing. Take the next question, and then Max can add his remark to whatever answer might be appropriate. So,
hi, my name is Benjamin Patrick, and I just finished up an internship at the Cato Institute. And my question is for Mr. Abrams. I share your concern about, like, obviously the Houthi rebels and deranged militant groups killing Americans who are just in ships overseas. I don't think our people should be at risk overseas. And so I would like to ask the question regarding the USS Liberty, which when it crossed into the Strait of Gibraltar, it established friendly contact with the IDF, and it was clearly marked with multiple American flags. And IDF airplanes proceeded to make friendly contact with it 3 times, but then when it approached Israel, IDF jets famously used bullets and napalm to attempt to murder everybody on board. And so my question is, in the context of Israeli troops almost never fighting with American troops in any of the wars that actually Israeli interests have advocated through various means that the U.S. get involved in, resulting in the deaths of tens of thousands of Americans and hundreds of thousands of civilians across the Middle East, what kind of supposedly good ally does that to another country? And is Israel actually our greatest ally, or is it even a good ally in the first place? Thank you.
Great. So there are certain questions I don't get to really answer, like what happened to building number 7, or, is it true that, there was a call up to the World Trade Center for the Jews to get out because, Tucker Carlson has a special history about the secret history of 9/11. As a professor, I try not to get deep into the conspiracy theory talk. People are welcome to look at the historical example of the Liberty going back to 1967. For me, what's much more useful is what's going on today, especially on issues which are not so empirically contested. With respect to the very important question of how do we prevent another 9/11, I think that, and this is going to really roll some people, but one of the very best ways, maybe the best way to prevent another 9/11 is not to recognize the state of Palestine. And the reason why I say that, I'm being serious. The reason why I'm saying that is because the conflict in Gaza is basically the premier grade A terrorist conflict around the world. Every single extremist in the world, almost regardless of their politics, is paying attention. If in the aftermath of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, Hamas is rewarded with a state, it is going to communicate to extremists all over the world that the best way to achieve their political aims, regardless of what they are, is to kill as many civilians as possible. Now, this might just seem like some kind of a hawkish talking point, but it is actually empirically based. There are numerous political scientists who have run regressions on large N studies. They're very good political scientists. People like Todd Sandler, he's not even a pro-Israel guy. He's just the most cited person in the world in terrorism studies. And one of his findings is that when terrorists are perceived as achieving their aims in one region of the world, it increases the likelihood that there will be even more terrorism. And that's true not just locally, it's also true internationally. And so I think it's very important for us not to deliver a Palestinian state now in order for us to show that Operation Al-Aqsa Flood and copycat operations around the world will not be politically beneficial. That doesn't mean that I'm categorically at all times opposed to a Palestinian state, but the timing now would incentivize more terrorism. If you want to deplete the global intifada of energy, you continue to smash Hamas and you give them nothing politically.
So we started the Q&A with Paul Gottfried, and we will conclude it with Oron McIntyre. So please ask a question, keep it brief, and then we'll have about 90 seconds each for our panelists.
Yeah, we're at the National Conservatism Conference, so I think it's important that we talk about national sovereignty. And my largest concern is ultimately that we are giving it away in this scenario. It was asserted that Israel is an ally that's absolutely worth having and worth any trade-offs that it comes with, and perhaps that's true, perhaps it's not. That's not the debate I'm interested in here. As Curt pointed out, ultimately, George Washington warned us against entangling alliances because it would divide our country. It would have us sitting in a room like this, saying that one person who isn't loyal to one country or another, therefore, is betraying this country. And he warned very stringently that that should not be something that we engage in. It's fine to have temporary alliances, but long-term, repeated alliances are very dangerous. Every political philosopher from Machiavelli to Thomas Hobbes to Carl Schmitt, I'm sorry, I invoked it, has said that when you have another country defending it, when they are the people who are actually the ones who are using their sword on your behalf, you lose sovereignty to them. So when we're here talking about the sovereignty of nations, but we're also suggesting that we have to be in long-term military alliances in which we are entirely dependent on each other for our own defense, are we not saying we are ceding our sovereignty to each other? I've heard Israelis say this about Americans, that they resent Americans telling them how to conduct themselves. I've heard Americans resentful that Israel has the level of influence it does on our military policy. So why are we doing this? Why are both countries feeling like they are not sovereign when we could simply actually act as sovereign nations?
Sure.
I just agree with everything you said there. So, I think if you had to trace back U.S. involvement in the Middle East, really for my lifetime, so 1990 on, but honestly really before, the overly tight relationship with Israel was a driving force in every theater. Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq. And our inability to solve the Israeli-Palestinian process is a continued thorn in the side of the U.S. being able to prioritize its own interests.
Okay, last word goes to Max.
Yeah, that's just historically not true. Obama wasn't leading from behind because Israel was leading the intervention in Libya. It was Europe that took the lead on that. With respect to the Iraq War, people who really know their history will know this. People who watch the news probably don't. But the Israeli prime minister at the time was Ariel Sharon. And Sharon told George W. Bush it will be a mistake to invade Iraq, and it would be an even bigger mistake to try to engage in these neocon fantasies of nation building and promoting democracy throughout the region. Ariel Sharon said that's not going to work. This idea that the United States has just ceded all control to Israel, and that Israel is leading, and that President Trump has no power, he has no agency of his own. Again, it's just not empirically supported. We saw in the latest war against Iran, which the realists got completely wrong, that the United States and Israel, although they have shared interests in degrading the Iranian nuclear program, that doesn't mean they have identical strategic interests. And yes, Israel's much more interested in regime change than Trump was. And Trump snapped his fingers. And what happened? The war ended and the Israelis came home. It's just not empirically based. It's not based on reality. It's based on this woke right rhetoric that Trump
Said
has
the word.
that Trump has no agency of his own. It's just not what's happening.
It's
And
also
I
not
think
the
that
assertion.
The
The
United
question-
States
Hold on.
should continue to pursue its interests, and to the extent that they overlap with Israel, they should work together, but no further.
Okay, so we are at time. In fact, we're exactly at 5:44, so the clock's about to tick, and that'll be the close. I want to thank both of our panelists. I want to thank you as an audience for being orderly, asking great questions. Obviously, there's much more to be said on this topic, and it will be said by Curt Mills and Max Abrahms in a variety of other forums. So thank you again.
Thank you, Curt.